Welcome to Bitesized Audio. I'm Simon Stanhope. I'm an actor and audiobook narrator, and I've recorded all the stories on this channel. Classic English short stories, mostly from the Victorian and Edwardian eras. If you enjoy this content, please subscribe, like, share, leave a comment if you'd like to, and thank you for listening. The Dust Cloud by E.F. Benson. The big French windows were open onto the lawn, and, dinner being over, 2 or 3 of the party who were staying for the week at the end of August with the Combe Martins had strolled out onto the terrace to look at the sea, over which the moon, large and low, was just rising, and tracing a path of pale gold from horizon to shore, while others, less lunar of inclination, had gone in search of bridge or billiards. Coffee had come round immediately after dessert, and the end of dinner, according to the delectable custom of the house, was as informal as the end of breakfast. Everyone, that is to say, remained or went away, smoked, drank port, or abstained, according to his personal tastes. Thus, on this particular evening, it so happened that Harry, Combe Martin, and I were very soon left alone in the dining-room, because we were talking unmitigated motor shop, and the rest of the party, small wonder, were bored with it and had left us. The shop was home shop, so to speak, for it was almost entirely concerned with the manifold perfections of the new 6-cylinder Napier, which my host, in a moment of extravagance, which he did not in the least regret, had just purchased. In which, too, he proposed to take me over to lunch at a friend's house near Hunstanton on the following day. He observed, with legitimate pride, that an early start would not be necessary, as the distance was only 80 miles, and there were no police traps. "Queer things these big motors are," he said, relapsing into generalities as we rose to go. "Often I can scarcely believe that my new car is merely a machine. It seems to me to possess an independent life of its own. It is really much more like a thoroughbred, with a wonderfully fine mouth." "And the moods of a thoroughbred?" I asked. "No, it's got an excellent temper, I'm glad to say. It doesn't mind being checked or even stopped when it's going its best. Some of these big cars can't stand that. They get sulky. I assure you, it is literally true, if they are checked too often." He paused on his way to ring the bell. "Guy Elphinston's car, for instance," he said. "It was a bad-tempered brute, a violent, vicious beast of a car." "What make?" I asked. 25 horsepower Amadei. They are a fretful strain of car, too thin, not enough bone, and bone is very good for the nerves. The brute liked running over a chicken or a rabbit, though perhaps it was less the car's ill temper than Guy's, poor chap. Well, he paid for it. He paid to the uttermost farthing. Did you know him?" "No, but surely I have heard the name." "Ah, yes, he ran over a child, did he not?" "Yes," said Harry, "and then smashed up against his own park gates." "Killed, wasn't he?" "Oh, yes, killed instantly, and the car just a heap of splinters. There's an odd story about it, I'm told, in the village, rather in your line." "Ghosts?" I asked. "Yes, the ghost of his motor car. Seems almost too up-to-date, doesn't it?" "And what's the story?" I demanded. "Why, just this. His place was outside the village of Bircham, 10 miles out from Norwich, and there's a long straight bit of road there. That's where he ran over the child. And a couple of 100 yards farther on, a rather awkward turn into the park gates. Well, a month or two ago, soon after the accident, one old gaffer in the village swore he had seen a motor there, coming full tilt along the road, but without a sound, and it disappeared at the lodge gates of the park, which were shut. Soon after, another said he had heard a motor whirl by him at the same place, followed by a hideous scream, but he saw nothing. "Well, the scream is rather horrible," said I. Yeah, I see what you mean. I only thought of his siren. Guy had a siren on his exhaust, same as I have. His had a dreadful frightened sort of wail, and always made me feel creepy." "And is that all the story?" I asked. "That one old man thought he saw a noiseless motor, and another thought he heard an invisible one?" Harry flicked the ash off his cigarette into the grate. "Oh dear, no," he said. "Half a dozen of them have seen something, or heard something. It is quite a heavily authenticated yarn." "Yes, and talked over and edited in the public house," I said. "Well, not a man of them will go there after dark. Also, the lodge-keeper gave notice a week or two after the accident. He said he was always hearing a motor stop and hoot outside the lodge, and he was kept running out at all hours of the night to see what it was." "And what was it?" "It wasn't anything, simply nothing there. He thought it rather uncanny, anyhow, and threw up a good post. Besides, his wife was always hearing a child scream, and while her man toddled out to the gate, she would go and see whether the kids were all right. And the kids themselves—" "Ah, what of them?" I asked. "They kept coming to their mother, asking who the little girl was who walked up and down the road, and would not speak to them or play with them." "It's a many-sided story," I said. "All the witnesses seem to have heard and seen different things." "Yes, that is just what to my mind makes the yarn so good," he said. "Personally, I don't take much stock in spooks at all, but given that there are such things as spooks, and given that the death of the child and the death of Guy have caused spooks to play about there, it seems to me a very good point that different people should be aware of different phenomena. One hears the car, another sees it. One hears the child scream, another sees the child. How does that strike you?" Well, this, I am bound to say, was a new view to me, and the more I thought of it, the more reasonable it appeared. For the vast majority of mankind have all those occult senses by which is perceived the spiritual world, which, I hold, is thick and populous around us, sealed up, as it were. In other words, the majority of mankind never hear or see a ghost at all. Is it not, then, very probable that of the remainder, those, in fact, to whom occult experiences have happened, or can happen, few should have every sense unsealed, but that some should have the unsealed ear, others the unsealed eye, that some should be clairaudient, others clairvoyant?" "Yes, it strikes me as reasonable," I said. "Can't you take me over there?" "Certainly. If you will stop till Friday, I'll take you over on Thursday. The others all go that day, so that we can get there after dark." I shook my head. "I can't stop till Friday, I'm afraid," I said. "I must leave on Thursday. But how about tomorrow? Can't we take it on the way to or from Hunstanton?" "No, it's 30 miles out of our way. Besides, to be at Bircham after dark means that we shouldn't get back here till midnight. And as host to my guests—" "Ah, things are only heard and seen after dark, are they?" I asked. "That makes it so much less interesting. It is like a séance, where all lights are put out." "Well, the accident happened at night," he said. "I don't know the rules, but that may have some bearing on it, I should think." I had one question more in the back of my mind, but I did not like to ask it. At least, I wanted information on this subject without appearing to ask for it. "Neither do I know the rules of motors," I said, "and I don't understand when you say that Guy Elphinstone's machine was an irritable, cross-grained brute that liked running over chickens and rabbits. But I think you subsequently said that the irritability may have been the irritability of its owner. Did he mind being checked? It made him blind mad, if it happened often, said Harry. I shall never forget a drive I had with him once. There were hay carts and perambulators every 100 yards. It was perfectly ghastly. It was like being with a madman, and when we got inside his gate, his dog came running out to meet him. He did not go an inch out of his course. It was worse than that. He went for it, just grinding his teeth with rage. I never drove with him again. He stopped a moment, guessing what might be in my mind. I say, you mustn't think, he began. No, of course not, said I. Harry Combe Martin's house stood close to the weather-eaten, sandy cliffs of Suffolk shore, which are being incessantly gnawed away by the hunger of the insatiable sea. Fathoms deep below it, and now many 100 yards out, lies what was once the second port of England, but now of the ancient town of Dunwich, and of its 7 great churches, nothing remains but one, and that ruinous, and already half destroyed by the falling cliff and the encroachments of the sea. Foot by foot, it too is disappearing, and of the graveyard which surrounded it, more than half is gone, so that from the face of the sandy cliff on which it stands, there stick out like straws in glass, as Dante says, the bones of those who were once committed there to the kindly and stable earth. Whether it was the remembrance of this rather grim spectacle, as I had seen it that afternoon, or whether Harry's story had caused some trouble in my brain, or whether it was merely that the keen, bracing air of this place, to one who had just come from the sleepy languor of the Norfolk Broads, kept me sleepless, I do not know. But anyhow, the moment I put out my light that night and got into bed, I felt that all the footlights and gas-jets in the internal theatre of my mind sprang into flame, and that I was very vividly and alertly awake. It was in vain that I counted 100 forwards and 100 backwards, that I pictured to myself a flock of visionary sheep coming singly through a gap in an imaginary hedge, and tried to number their monotonous and uniform countenances, that I played noughts and crosses with myself, that I marked out scores of double lawn tennis courts, for with each repetition of these supposedly soporific exercises, I only became more intensely wakeful. It was not in remote hope of sleep that I continued to repeat these weary performances, long after their inefficacy was proved to the hilt, but because I was strangely unwilling, in this timeless hour of the night, to think about those protruding relics of humanity. Also, I quite distinctly did not desire to think about that subject, with regard to which I had, a few hours ago, promised Harry that I would not make it the subject of reflection. For these reasons, I continued, during the black hours, to practise these narcotic exercises of the mind, knowing well that if I paused on the tedious treadmill, my thoughts, like some released spring, would fly back to rather gruesome subjects. I kept my mind, in fact, talking loud to itself, so that it should not hear what other voices were saying. Then, by degrees, these absurd mental occupations became impossible. My mind simply refused to occupy itself with them any longer, and next moment I was thinking intently and eagerly, not about the bones protruding from the gnawed section of Sandcliff, but about the subject I had said I would not dwell upon. And like a flash, it came upon me why Harry had bidden me not to think about it. Surely, in order that I should not come to the same conclusion as he had come to. Now, the whole question of haunted spots, haunted houses, and so forth, has always seemed to me to be utterly unsolved, and to be neither proved nor disproved to a satisfactory degree. From the earliest times, certainly from the earliest known Egyptian records, there has been a belief that the scene of a crime is often revisited, sometimes by the spirit of him who has committed it, seeking rest, we must suppose, and finding none. Sometimes, and more inexplicably, by the spirit of his victim, crying, perhaps, like the blood of Abel, for vengeance. And though the stories of these village gossips in the ale-house, about noiseless visions and invisible noises, were all as yet unsifted and unreliable, yet I could not help wondering if they, such as they were, pointed to something authentic and to be classed under this head of appearances. But more striking than the yarns of the gaffers seemed to me the questions of the lodge-keeper's children. How should children have imagined the figure of a child that would not speak to them or play with them? Perhaps it was a real child, a sulky child. Yes, perhaps, but perhaps not. Then, after this preliminary skirmish, I found myself settling down to the question that I had said I would not think about. In other words, the possible origin of these phenomena interested me more than the phenomena themselves. For what exactly had Guy Elphinston, that savage driver, done? Had, or had not, the death of the child been entirely an accident, a thing, given he drove a motor at all, outside his own control? Or had he, irritated beyond endurance at the checks and delays of the day, not pulled up when it was just possible he might have, but had run over the child, as he would have run over a rabbit or a hen, or even his own dog? And what, in any case, poor wretched brute, must have been his thoughts in that terrible instant that intervened between the child's death and his own, when a moment later he smashed into the closed gates of his own lodge? Was remorse his, bitter, despairing contrition? That could hardly have been so, or else, surely, knowing only for certain that he had knocked a child down, he would have stopped. He would have done his best, whatever that might be, to repair the irreparable harm. But he had not stopped. He had gone on, it seemed, at full speed, for on the collision the car had been smashed into matchwood and steel shavings. Again, with double force, had this dreadful thing been a complete accident, he would have stopped. So then, most terrible question of all, had he, after making murder, rushed on to what proved to be his own death, filled with some hellish glee at what he had done? Indeed, as in the churchyard on the cliff, bones of the buried stuck starkly out into the night. The pale, tired light of earliest morning had turned the window blinds into glimmering squares before I slept, and when I woke, the servant who called me was already rattling them briskly up on their rollers, and letting the calm serenity of the August day stream into the room. Through the open windows poured in sunlight and sea wind, the scent of flowers and the song of birds, and each and all were wonderfully reassuring, banishing the hooded forms that had haunted the night, and I thought of the disquietude of the dark hours as a traveller may think of the billows and tempests of the ocean over which he has safely journeyed, unable, now that they belong to the limbo of the past, to recall his qualms and tossings with any vivid uneasiness. Not without a feeling of relief, too, did I dwell on the knowledge that I was definitely not going to visit this equivocal spot. Our drive today, as Harry had said, would not take us within 30 miles of it, and tomorrow I but went to the station and away. Though a thorough-paced seeker after truth might, no doubt, have regretted that the laws of time and space did not permit him to visit Bircham after the sinister dark had fallen, and test whether for him there was visible or audible truth in the tales of the village gossips, I was conscious of no such regret. Bircham and its fables had given me a very bad night, and I was perfectly aware that I did not in the least want to go near it, though yesterday I had quite truthfully said I should like to do so. In this brightness, too, of sun and sea wind, I felt none of the malaise at my waking moments which a sleepless night usually gives me. I felt particularly well, particularly pleased to be alive, and also, as I have said, particularly content not to be going to Bircham. I was quite satisfied to leave my curiosity unsatisfied. The motor came round about 11, and we started at once, Harry and Mrs. Morrison, a cousin of his, sitting behind in the big back seat, large enough to hold a comfortable 3, and I on the left of the driver, in a sort of trance, I am not ashamed to confess it, of expectancy and delight. For this was in the early days of motors, when there was still the sense of romance and adventure round them. I did not want to drive, any more than Harry wanted to, for driving, so I hold, is too absorbing. It takes the attention in too firm a grip. The mania of the true motorist is not consciously enjoyed. For the passion for motors is a taste, I had almost said a gift, as distinct and as keenly individual as the passion for music or mathematics. Those who use motors most, merely as a means of getting rapidly from one place to another, are often entirely without it, while those whom adverse circumstances, over which they have no control, compel to use them least, may have it to a supreme degree. To those who have it, analysis of their passion is perhaps superfluous. To those who have it not, explanation is almost unintelligible. Pace, however, and the control of pace, and above all the sensuous consciousness of pace, is at the root of it, and pleasure in pace is common to most people, whether it be in the form of a galloping horse, or the pace of the skate hissing over smooth ice, or the pace of a free-wheel bicycle humming downhill, or, more impersonally, the pace of the smashed ball at lawn tennis, the driven ball at golf, or the low boundary hit at cricket. But the sensuous consciousness of pace, as I have said, is needful. One might experience it seated in front of the engine of an express train, though not in a wadded, shut-windowed carriage, where the wind of movement is not felt. Then add to this rapture of the rush through riven air the knowledge that huge relentless force is controlled by a little lever, and directed by a little wheel, on which the hands of the driver seem to lie so negligently. A great untamed devil has there his bridle, and he answers to it, as Harry had said, like a horse with a fine mouth. He has hunger and thirst, too, unslakable, and greedily he laps of his soup of petrol, which turns to fire in his mouth. Electricity, the force that rends clouds asunder and causes towers to totter, is the spoon with which he feeds himself, and as he eats, he races onward, and the road opens like torn linen in front of him. Yet how obedient, how amenable is he, for with a touch on his snaffle his speed is redoubled, or melts into thin air, so that before you know you have touched the rein, he has exchanged his swallow flight for a mere saunter through the lanes. But he ever loves to run, and knowing this, you will bid him lift up his voice and tell those who are in his path that he is coming, so that he will not need the touch that checks. Hoarse and jovial is his voice, hooting to the wayfarer, and if his hooting be not heard, he has a great guttural falsetto scream that leaps from octave to octave, and echoes from the hedges that are passing in blurred lines of hanging green. And, as you go, the romantic isolation of divers in deep seas is yours. Masked and hooded companions may be near you also, in their driving dress for this plunge through the swift tides of air, but you, like them, are alone and isolated, conscious only of the ripped riband of road, the two great lantern eyes of the wonderful monster that look through drooped eyelids by day, but gleam with fire by night, the two ear-laps of splashboards, and the long lean bonnet in front, which is the skull and brain-case of that swift, untiring energy that feeds on fire and whirls its 2 tons of weight up hill and down dale, as if some new law, as everlasting as gravity, and like gravity making it go ever swifter, was its sole control. For the first hour, the essence of these joys, any description of which compared to the real thing is but as a stagnant pond compared to the bright rushing of a mountain stream, was mine. A straight, switchback road lay in front of us, and the monster plunged silently downhill, and said below his breath, "Ha-ha, ha-ha, ha-ha," as, without diminution of speed, he breasted the opposing slope. In my control were his great vocal cords, for in those days hooter and siren were on the driver's left, and lay convenient to the hand of him who occupied the box seat. And it rejoiced me to let him hoot to a pony cart 300 yards ahead, with a hand on his falsetto scream if his ordinary tones of conversation were unheard or disregarded. Then came a road crossing ours at right angles, and the dear monster seemed to say, "Yes, yes, see how obedient and careful I am. I stroll with my hands in my pockets." Then again a puppy from a farmhouse staggered warlike into the road, and the monster said, "Poor little chap, get home to your mother, or I'll talk to you in earnest." The poor little chap did not take the hint, so the monster slackened speed, and just said, "Woof." Then it chuckled to itself as the puppy scuttled into the hedge, seriously alarmed, and next moment our self-made wind screeched and whistled round us again. Napoleon, I believe, said that the power of an army lay in its feet. That is true also of the monster. There was a loud bang, and in 30 seconds we were at a standstill. The monster's off forefoot troubled it, and the chauffeur said, "Yes, sir, burst." So the burst boot was taken off, and a new one put on, a boot that had never been on foot before. The foot in question was held up on a jack during this operation, and the new boot laced up with a pump. This took exactly 25 minutes. Then the monster got his spoon going again, and said, "Let me run, oh, let me run." And for 15 miles, on a straight and empty road, it ran. I timed the miles, but shall not produce their chronology for the benefit of a forsworn constabulary. But there were no more dithyrambics that morning. We should have reached Hunstanton in time for lunch. Instead, we waited to repair our fourth puncture at 1:45 p.m., 25 miles short of our destination. This fourth puncture was caused by a spicule of flint 3/4 of an inch long, sharp, it is true, but weighing perhaps 2 pennyweights, while we weighed 2 tons. It seemed an impertinence. So we lunched at a wayside inn, and during lunch the pundits held a consultation, of which the upshot was this. We had no more boots for our monster, for his off forefoot had burst once and punctured once, thus necessitating 2 socks and 1 boot. Similarly, but more so, his off hind foot had burst twice, thus necessitating 2 boots and 2 socks. Now, there was no certain shoemaker's shop at Hunstanton, as far as we knew, but there was a regular universal store at King's Lynn, which was about equidistant. And, so said the chauffeur, there was something wrong with the monster's spoon, ignition, and he didn't rightly know what, and therefore it seemed the prudent part not to go to Hunstanton, lunch, a thing of the preterite, having been the object, but to the well-supplied King's Lynn, and we all breathed a pious hope that we might get there. Whiz, hoot, purr. The last boot held. The spoon went busily to the monster's mouth, and we just flowed into King's Lynn. The return journey, so I vaguely gathered, would be made by other roads, but personally, intoxicated with air and movement, I neither asked nor desired to know what those roads would be. This one small but rather salient fact is necessary to record here, that as we waited at King's Lynn, and as we buzzed homewards afterwards, no thought of Bircham entered my head at all. The subsequent hallucination, if hallucination it was not, as far as I know, self-suggested. That we had gone out of our way for the sake of the garage I knew, and that was all. Harry also told me that he did not know where our road would take us. The rest that follows is the baldest possible narrative of what actually occurred. But it seems to me, a humble student of the occult, to be curious. While we waited, we had tea in a hotel looking onto a big empty square of houses, and after tea we waited a very long time for our monster to pick us up. Then the telephone from the garage inquired for the gentleman on the motor, and since Harry had strolled out to get a local evening paper with news of the last test match, I applied ear and mouth to that elusive instrument. What I heard was not encouraging. The ignition had gone very wrong indeed, and perhaps in an hour we should be able to start. It was then about 6:30, and we were just 78 miles from Dunwich. Harry came back soon after this, and I told him what the message from the garage had been. What he said was this: "Then we shan't get back till long after dinner. We might just as well have camped out to see your ghost." As I have already said, no notion of Bircham was in my mind, and I mention this as evidence that, even if it had been, Harry's remark would have implied that we were not going through Bircham. The hour lengthened itself into an hour and a half. Then the monster, quite well again, came hooting round the corner, and we got in. "Whack her up, Jack," said Harry to the chauffeur. "The roads will be empty. You had better light up at once." The monster, with its eyes agleam, was whacked up, and never in my life have I been carried so cautiously and yet so swiftly. Jack never took a risk, or the possibility of a risk, but when the road was clear and open, he let the monster run just as fast as it was able. Its eyes made day of the road 50 yards ahead, and the romance of night was fairyland round us. Hares started from the roadside, and raced in front of us for 100 yards, then just wheeled in time to avoid the ear-flaps of the great triumphant brute that carried us. Moths flitted across, struck, sometimes, by the lenses of its eyes, and the miles peeled over our shoulders. When it occurred, we were going top speed, and this was it. Quite unsensational, but to us quite inexplicable, unless my midnight imaginings happened to be true. As I have said, I was in command of the hooter and of the siren. We were flying along on a straight downgrade, as fast as ever we could go, for the engines were working, though the decline was considerable. Then, quite suddenly, I saw in front of us a thick cloud of dust, and knew instinctively, and on the instant, without thought or reasoning, what that must mean. Evidently, something going very fast, or else so large a cloud could not have been raised, was in front of us, and going in the same direction as ourselves. Had it been something on the road coming to meet us, we should, of course, have seen the vehicle first, and run into the dust cloud afterwards. Had it, again, been something of low speed, a horse and dog cart, for instance, no such dust could have been raised. But as it was, I knew at once that there was a motor travelling swiftly just ahead of us, also that it was not going as fast as we were, or we should have run into its dust much more gradually. But we went into it as into a suddenly lowered curtain. Then I shouted to Jack. "Slow down, and put on the brake," I shrieked. "There's something just ahead of us." As I spoke, I wrought a wild concerto on the hooter, and with my right hand groped for the siren, but did not find it. Simultaneously, I heard a wild, frightened shriek, just as if I had sounded the siren myself. Jack had felt for it too, and our hands fingered each other. Then we entered the dust cloud. We slowed down with extraordinary rapidity, and still peering ahead, we went dead slow through it. I had not put on my goggles after leaving King's Lynn, and the dust stung and smarted in my eyes. It was not, therefore, a belt of fog, but real road dust. And at the moment we crept through it, I felt Harry's hands on my shoulder. "There's something just ahead," he said. "Look, don't you see the tail light?" As a matter of fact, I did not, and, still going very slow, we came out of that dust cloud. The broad, empty road stretched in front of us. A hedge was on each side, and there was no turning either to right or left. Only on the right was a lodge and gates which were closed. The lodge had no lights in any window. Then we came to a standstill. The air was dead calm. Not a leaf in the hedgerow trees was moving. Not a grain of dust was lifted from the road. But behind, the dust cloud still hung in the air, and stopped dead short at the closed lodge gates. We had moved very slowly for the last 100 yards. It was difficult to suppose that it was of our making. Then Jack spoke, with a curious crack in his voice. "It must have been a motor, sir," he said. "But where is it?" I had no reply to this, and from behind another voice, Harry's voice, spoke. For the moment I did not recognize it, for it was strained and faltering. "Did you open the siren?" he asked. "It didn't sound like our siren. It sounded like... "I didn't open the siren," said I. Then we went on again. Soon we came to scattered lights in houses by the wayside. "What's this place?" I asked Jack. "Bircham, sir," said he. How It Happened, by Arthur Conan Doyle. She was a writing medium. This is what she wrote. I can remember some things upon that evening most distinctly, and others are like some vague, broken dreams. That is what makes it so difficult to tell a connected story. I have no idea now what it was that had taken me to London and brought me back so late. It just merges into all my other visits to London. But from the time that I got out at the little country station, everything is extraordinarily clear. I can live it again, every instant of it. I remember so well walking down the platform and looking at the illuminated clock at the end, which told me that it was 11:30. I remember also my wondering whether I could get home before midnight. Then I remember the big motor, with its glaring headlights and glitter of polished brass, waiting for me outside. It was my new 30-horsepower Rover, which had only been delivered that day. I remember also asking Perkins, my chauffeur, how she had gone, and his saying that he thought she was excellent. "I'll try her myself," said I, and I climbed into the driver's seat. "The gears are not the same," said he. "Perhaps, sir, I had better drive." "No, I should like to try her," said I. And so we started on the 5-mile drive for home. My old car had the gears as they used always to be, in notches on a bar. In this car you passed the gear lever through a gate to get on the higher ones. It was not difficult to master, and soon I thought that I understood it. It was foolish, no doubt, to begin to learn a new system in the dark, but one often does foolish things, and one has not always to pay the full price for them. I got along very well until I came to Claystall Hill. It is one of the worst hills in England, 1.5 miles long, and 1 in 6 in places, with 3 fairly sharp curves. My park gates stand at the very foot of it upon the main London road. We were just over the brow of this hill, where the grade is steepest, when the trouble began. I had been on the top speed, and wanted to get her on the free, but she stuck between gears, and I had to get her back on the top again. By this time she was going at a great speed, so I clapped on both brakes, and one after the other they gave way. I didn't mind so much when I felt my foot brake snap, but when I put all my weight on my side brake, and the lever clanged to its full limit without a catch, it brought a cold sweat out of me. By this time we were fairly tearing down the slope. The lights were brilliant, and I brought her round the first curve all right. Then we did the second one, though it was a close shave for the ditch. There was a mile of straight then, with the third curve beneath it, and after that the gate of the park. If I could shoot into that harbour, all would be well, for the slope up to the house would bring her to a stand. Perkins behaved splendidly. I should like that to be known. He was perfectly cool and alert. I had thought at the very beginning of taking the bank, and he read my intention. "I wouldn't do it, sir," said he. "At this pace it must go over, and we should have it on the top of us." Of course he was right. He got to the electric switch and had it off, so we were in the free, but we were still running at a fearful pace. He laid his hands on the wheel. "I'll keep her steady," said he, "if you care to jump and chance it. We can never get round that curve. Better jump, sir." "No," said I. "I'll stick it out. You can jump if you like." "I'll stick it with you, sir," said he. If it had been the old car, I should have jammed the gear lever into the reverse and seen what would happen. I expect she would have stripped her gears or smashed up somehow, but it would have been a chance. As it was, I was helpless. Perkins tried to climb across, but you couldn't do it going at that pace. The wheels were whirring like a high wind, and the big body creaking and groaning with the strain. But the lights were brilliant, and one could steer to an inch. I remember thinking what an awful and yet majestic sight we should appear to anyone who met us. It was a narrow road, and we were just a great, roaring, golden death to anyone who came in our path. We got round the corner with one wheel 3 feet high upon the bank. I thought we were surely over, but after staggering for a moment she righted and darted onwards. That was the third corner, and the last one. There was only the park gate now. It was facing us, but, as luck would have it, not facing us directly. It was about 20 yards to the left, up the main road into which we ran. Perhaps I could have done it, but I expect that the steering gear had been jarred when we ran on the bank. The wheel did not turn easily. We shot out of the lane. I saw the open gate on the left. I whirled round my wheel with all the strength of my wrists. Perkins and I threw our bodies across, and then the next instant, going at 50 miles an hour, my right front wheel struck full on the right-hand pillar of my own gate. I heard the crash. I was conscious of flying through the air. And then... When I became aware of my own existence once more, I was among some brushwood in the shadow of the oaks upon the lodge side of the drive. A man was standing beside me. I imagined at first that it was Perkins, but when I looked again, I saw that it was Stanley, a man whom I had known at college some years before, and for whom I had a really genuine affection. There was always something peculiarly sympathetic to me in Stanley's personality, and I was proud to think that I had some similar influence upon him. At the present moment I was surprised to see him, but I was like a man in a dream, giddy and shaken, and quite prepared to take things as I found them, without questioning them. "What a smash!" I said. "Good Lord, what an awful smash!" He nodded his head, and even in the gloom I could see that he was smiling the gentle, wistful smile which I connected with him. I was quite unable to move. Indeed, I had not any desire to try to move. But my senses were exceedingly alert. I saw the wreck of the motor lit up by the moving lanterns. I saw the little group of people and heard the hushed voices. There were the lodge-keeper and his wife, and 1 or 2 more. They were taking no notice of me, but were very busy round the car. Then, suddenly, I heard a cry of pain. "The weight is on him! Lift it easy!" cried a voice. "It's only my leg," said another one, which I recognized as Perkins. "Where's master?" he cried. "Here I am," I answered, but they did not seem to hear me. They were all bending over something which lay in front of the car. Stanley laid his hand upon my shoulder, and his touch was inexpressibly soothing. I felt light and happy in spite of all. "No pain, of course," said he. "None," said I. "There never is," said he. And then, suddenly, a wave of amazement passed over me. "Stanley? Stanley? Why, Stanley had surely died of enteric at Bloemfontein in the Boer War." "Stanley?" I cried, and the words seemed to choke my throat. "Stanley? You are dead." He looked at me with the same old, gentle, wistful smile. "So are you," he answered. Lord Beden's Motor by J.B. Harris-Burland. A hard man was Rafe Strang, 7th Earl of Beden, 70 years of age on his last birthday, but still upright as a dart, with hair white as snow, but with the devilry of youth still sparkling in his keen, dark eyes. He was, indeed, able to follow the hounds with the best of us, and there were few men, even among the youngest and most hot-headed of our riders, who cared to follow him over all the jumps he put his horse at. When I first came to Up Stanway as a doctor, I thought it strange that so good a sportsman should be so unpopular. As a rule, a man can do pretty well anything in a sporting county, so long as he rides straight to hounds. But before I had been in the place a month, I attended him after a fall in the hunting field, and I saw that a man like that would be unpopular even if he gave all his goods to the poor, and lived the life of St. Francis of Assisi. Not that he was harsh, or even unpleasant, but he had the knack of making one feel foolish and uncomfortable, and there was something in the expression of his eyes that made one unable to look him squarely in the face. His manners, indeed, were perfect, and he retained all the old-world courtliness which seems to have been permanently abandoned by this generation. But I could not help feeling that underneath all his politeness, and even hospitality, lay a solid substratum of contempt. It was doubtless this impression which had earned him his unpopularity, for I never heard a single one of his enemies lay anything definite to his charge, beyond the fact that his elder brother had died in a lunatic asylum, and that Lord Beden was in some vague way held responsible for this unfortunate event. But it was not until Lord Beden purchased a 12-horsepower Napier motor car that the villagers really began to consider him possessed of a devil. And certainly his spirit of devilry seemed to have found a worthy plaything in that grey mass of snorting machinery which went through the lanes like a whirlwind, enveloped in a cloud of dust, and scattering every living thing close back against the hedges, as a steamer dashes the waves against the banks of a river. I had often heard people whisper that he bore a charmed life in the hunting field, and that another and better man would have been killed years ago. And he certainly carried the same spirit of dash and foolhardiness, and also the same good fortune into a still more dangerous pursuit. It was the purchase of this car that brought me into closer contact with him. I had had some experience of motors, and he was sufficiently humble to take some instructions from me, and also to let me accompany him on several occasions. At first I drove the car myself, and tried to inculcate a certain amount of caution by example. But after the third lesson he knew as much about it as I did, and, resigning the steering gear into his hands, I took my place by his side with some misgivings. I must confess that he handled it splendidly. The man had a wonderful nerve, and when an inch to one side or the other would probably have meant death, his keen eye never made a mistake, and his hand on the wheel was as steady as a rock. This inspired confidence, and though the strain on my nerves was considerable, I found, after a time, a certain pleasurable excitement in these rides. And it was excitement, I can tell you. No 12 miles an hour for Lord Beden, no precautionary brakes downhill, no wide curves for corners. He rode, as he did to hounds, straight and fast. Sometimes we had 6 inches to spare, but never more, and, as often as not, another half-inch would have shot us both out of the car. We always seemed to come round a sharp corner on 2 wheels. It was certainly exhilarating, but there was something about it I did not quite like. I don't think I was physically afraid, but I recalled certain stories about Lord Beden's mad exploits in the hunting field, and it almost seemed to me as though he might be purposely riding for a fall. Then, all at once, my invitations to ride with him ceased. I thought at first that I had offended him, but I could think of no possible cause of offence. And, besides, his manner towards me had not changed in any way, and I dined with him more than once at Beden Hall, where he was courteous and irritating as usual. However, he offered no explanation, and I certainly did not intend to ask for one. I watched him narrowly when we talked about the motor, but he made no mystery about his rides. I noticed, however, that he looked older and more careworn, and that his dark eyes burned now with an almost unnatural brilliancy. I met him 2 or 3 times on the road when I was going my rounds in the trap, and he appeared to be driving his machine more furiously and fearlessly than ever. I was almost glad that his invitations had ceased. Strangely enough, I always encountered him on the same road, one which led straight to Oxminster, a town about 20 miles away. One evening, however, late in August, while I was finishing my dinner in solitude, I heard a familiar hum and rattle along the road in the distance. In less than a minute, I saw the flash of bright lamps through my open window, and heard the jar of a brake. Then there was a ring at the bell, and Lord Beden was announced. "Good evening, Scott," he said, taking off his glasses. "Lovely night, isn't it? Would you care to come for a ride?" He looked very pale, and was covered with dust from head to foot. "A ride, Lord Beden?" I replied, thoughtfully. "Well, I hardly know what to say. Will you have some coffee and a cigar?" He nodded assent and sat down. I poured him out some coffee, and noticed that his hand shook as he raised the cup to his lips. But driving a motor car at a rapid rate might easily produce this effect. Then I handed him a cigar and lit one myself. "Rather late for a ride, isn't it?" I said, after a slight pause. Not a bit, he answered hastily. "It is as bright as day, and the road's clear of traffic. Come, it will do you good. We can finish our cigars in the car." "Yes," I replied thoughtfully. "Or, at any rate, the draught will finish them for us." "Look here, Scott," he continued in a lower voice, leaning over the table and looking me straight in the eyes. "I particularly want you to come. In fact, you must come, to oblige me. I want you to see something which I have seen. I am a little doubtful of its actual existence." I looked at him sharply. His voice was cold and quiet, but his eyes were certainly a bit too bright. I should say that he was in a state of intense excitement, yet with all his nerves well under control. I laughed a little uneasily. "Very well, Lord Beden," I replied, rising from my chair. "I will come, but you will excuse me saying that you don't look well tonight. I think you are rather overdoing this motor business. It shakes the system up a good deal, you know." "I am not well, Scott," he said, "but you cannot cure me." I said no more, and left the room to put on my glasses and an overcoat. We set off through the village at about 10 miles an hour. It was a glorious night, and the moon shone clear in the sky. But I noticed a bank of heavy clouds in the west, and thought it not unlikely that we should have a thunderstorm. The atmosphere had been suffocating all day, and it was only the motion of the car that created the cool and pleasant breeze which blew against our faces. When we came to the church, we turned sharp to the right, onto the Oxminster Road. It ran in a perfectly straight white line for 3 miles. Then it began to wind and ascend the Oxbourne Hills, finally disappearing in the darkness of some woods which extend for nearly 5 miles over the summit in the direction of Oxminster. "Where are we going to?" I asked, settling myself firmly in my seat. "Oxminster," he replied, rather curtly. "Please keep your eyes open, and tell me if you see anything on the road." As he spoke, he pulled the lever farther towards him, and the great machine shot forward with a sudden plunge which would have unseated me if I had not been prepared for something of the sort. We quickly gathered up speed. Hedges and trees went past us like a flash. The dust whirled up into the moonlight like a silver cloud, and before 5 minutes had elapsed we were at the foot of the hills, and were tearing up the slope at almost the same terrific pace. As we ascended, the foliage began to thicken and close in upon us on either side. Then the moon disappeared, and only our powerful lamps illuminated the darkness ahead of us. The car was a magnificent hill climber, but the gradient soon became so steep that the pace slackened down to about 8 miles an hour. Lord Beden had not spoken a word since he told me where we were going to, but he had kept his eyes steadily fixed on the broad circle of light in front of the car. I began to find the silence and darkness oppressive, and, to say the truth, was not quite comfortable in my own mind about my companion's sanity. I took off my glasses and tried to pierce the darkness on either side. The moon filtered through the trees and made strange shadows in the depths of the woods, but there was nothing else to be seen, and ahead of us there was only a white streak of road, disappearing into blackness. Then, suddenly, my companion let go of the steering gear with one hand and clutched me by the arm. "Listen, Scott," he cried. "Do you hear it?" I listened attentively, and at first heard nothing but the throb of the motor, and a faint rustling among the trees as a slight breeze began to stir through the wood. Then I noticed that the beat of the piston was not quite the same as usual. It sounded jerky and irregular, faint and loud alternately, and I had an idea that it had considerably quickened in speed. "I hear nothing, Lord Beden," I replied, "except that the engine sounds a little erratic. It ought not to make so much fuss over this hill." "If you listen more carefully," he said, "you will understand. That sound is the beat of 2 pistons, and one of them is some way off." I listened again. He was right. There was certainly another engine throbbing in the distance. "I cannot see any lights," I answered, looking first in front of us and then into the darkness behind. "But it's another motor, I suppose. It does not appear to me to be anything out of the way." He did not reply, but replaced his hand on the steering gear and peered anxiously ahead. I began to feel a bit worried about him. It was strange that he should get so excited about the presence of another motor car in the neighbourhood. I was not reassured either when, in rearranging the rug about my legs, I touched something hard in his pocket. I passed my fingers lightly over it, and had no doubt whatever that it was a revolver. I began to be sorry I had come. A revolver is not a necessary tool for the proper running of a motor car. We were nearly at the top of the hill now, and still in the shadow of the trees. The road here runs for more than a mile along the summit before it begins to descend, and halfway along the level another road crosses it at right angles, leading one way down a steep slope to Little Stanway, and the other along the top of the Oxbourne Hills to Kelston and Rutherton, 2 small villages some miles away on the edge of the moors. We had scarcely reached the level when a few heavy drops of rain began to fall, and, looking up, I saw that the moon was no longer visible through the branches overhead. A minute later there was a low roll of thunder in the distance, and for an instant the scenery ahead of us flashed bright and faded into darkness. I turned up the collar of my coat. The car was now moving almost at full speed, but to my surprise, before we had gone a quarter of a mile, Lord Beden slowed it down and finally brought it to a full stop with the brake. Then he appeared to be listening attentively for something, but the rising wind and pouring rain had begun to make an incessant noise among the trees, and the thunder had become more loud and continuous. I strained my sense of hearing to the utmost, but I could hear nothing beyond the sounds of the elements. "What is the matter?" I queried impatiently. "Are we going to stop here?" "Yes," he replied curtly. "That is to say, if you have no objection. There is a certain amount of shelter." I drew a cigar from my pocket, and after several attempts managed to light it. To say the truth, I was in hopes that we should go no farther. The downward descent, 3/4 of a mile ahead of us, was about 1 in 10, and I did not feel much inclined to let my companion take me down a hill of that sort. Then, for a few seconds, the rustling of the wind and pattering of the rain ceased among the trees, and once more I could distinctly hear the thud, thud, thud of an engine. It might have been a motor car, but it certainly sounded to me more like the noise a traction engine would make. As we listened, the sound came nearer and nearer, and appeared to be on our left, still some distance down the hill. Then the storm broke out again with fresh fury, and we could hear nothing else. Lord Beden pulled the lever towards him, and we ran slowly forward until we were within 30 yards of the crossroads, when he again brought the machine to a standstill. The noise had become much louder now, and was even audible above the roar of the wind and rain. It certainly came from somewhere on our left. I looked down through the trees, and thought I saw a faint red glow some way down the hill. Lord Beden saw it too, and pointed to it with a trembling hand. "Looks like a fire in the wood," I said carelessly. I did not very much care what it was. "Don't be a fool," he replied sharply. "Can't you see it's moving?" Yes, he was right. It was certainly moving, and in a few seconds it was hidden by a thicker mass of foliage. I did not, however, see anything very noticeable about it. It was evidently coming up the road to our left, and was probably a belated traction engine returning home from the reaping. I was more than ever convinced of my companion's insanity, and wished that I was safe at home. I had half a mind to get off the car and walk, but he had by now managed to infect me with some of his own fear and excitement, and I did not quite fancy being left with no swifter mode of progression than my feet. The thumping sound came nearer and nearer, and, as we heard it more distinctly, was even more suggestive of a traction engine. Then I saw a red light through the trees, like the glow of a furnace, and not more than 50 yards away from us. My companion laid his left hand on the lever, and stared intently at the corner. Then a rather peculiar thing happened. Whatever it was that had been lumbering slowly up the hill, like a gigantic snail, suddenly shot across the road in front of us, like a streak of smoke and flame, and through the trees to our right I could see the red glow spinning up the road to Kelston, at over 30 miles an hour. Almost simultaneously, Lord Beden pulled down the lever, and I instinctively clutched the seat with both hands. We shot forward, took the corner with about an inch to spare between us and the ditch, and dashed off along the road in hot pursuit. But the red glow had got at least 1/4 of a mile's start, and I could not see what it proceeded from. A flash of lightning, however, showed a dark mass flying before us in a cloud of smoke. It looked something like a large wagon with a chimney sticking out of it, and sparks streamed out of the back of it until they looked like the tail of a comet. "What the deuce is it?" I said. "You'll see when we come up to it," the Earl answered, between his teeth. "We shall go faster in a few minutes." We were, however, going quite fast enough for me, and though I have ridden on many motors since, and occasionally at a greater speed, I shall never forget that ride along the Kelston Road. The powerful engine beneath us trembled as though it were going to fall to pieces. The rain lashed our faces like the thongs of a whip. The thunder almost deafened us. The lightning first blinded us with its flashes, and then left us in more confusing darkness. And, to crown all, a dense volume of smoke poured from the machine in front, and hid the light of our own lamps. It would be hard to imagine worse conditions for a motor ride, and a man who could keep a steady hand on the steering gear under circumstances like these was a man indeed. I should not have cared to try it, even in the daytime. But Lord Beden's luck was with him still, and we moved as though guided by some unseen hand. "You will find a small lever by your side, Scott," he said, after a long pause. "Pull it towards you until it gives a click. It is an invention of my own." I found the handle, and, following out his instructions, saw the arc of light from our lamps shoot another 50 yards ahead, leaving the ground immediately in front of the car in darkness. We had gained considerably. The light just impinged on the streaming tail of sparks. "At last," my companion muttered. "He has always had half a mile's start before, and the oil has given out before I could catch him. But he cannot escape us now." "What is it, Lord Beden?" "I am glad you see it," he replied. "I thought before tonight that it was a fancy of my brain." "Well, of course I see it," I said sharply. "I am not blind, but what is it?" He did not answer, but a flash of lightning showed me his face, and I did not repeat the question. Mile after mile we spun along the lonely country road, but never gaining another inch. We dashed through Kelston like a streak of light. It was fortunate that all the inhabitants were in bed. Then we shot out onto a road leading across the open moor, which stretches from here to the sea 20 miles away, and I remembered that 8 miles from Kelston there was a deep descent into the valley of the Stour, and it was scarcely possible that we could escape destruction. I quickly made up my mind to overpower Lord Beden and gain control of the machine. Then we suddenly began to sweep down a long and gentle gradient, and second after second our speed increased, until the arc of light shone on the machine ahead of us, and I could see what manner of thing it was that we pursued. It was, I suppose, a kind of motor car, but unlike anything I had ever seen before, and bearing no more resemblance to a modern machine than a bone-shaker of 20 years ago does to the modern free wheel. It appeared to be built of iron, and was painted a dead black. In the forepart of the structure, a 5-foot flywheel spun round at a terrific speed, and various bars and beams moved rapidly backwards and forwards. The chimney was quite 10 feet in height, and poured out a dense volume of smoke. On a small platform behind, railed in by a stout iron rail, stood a tall man with his back to us. His dark hair, which must have reached nearly to his shoulders, streamed behind him in the wind. In each hand he grasped a huge lever, and he was apparently gazing steadily into the darkness before him, though it seemed to me that he might just as well have shut his eyes, for the machine had no lamps, and the only light in the whole concern streamed out from the half-open furnace door. Then, to my amazement, I saw the man take his hands off the levers and coolly proceed to shovel coal into the roaring fire. I held my breath, expecting to see the flying mass of iron shoot off the side of the road and turn head over heels down the sloping grass. But nothing happened. The machine apparently required no guidance, and proceeded on its way as smoothly and swiftly as before. I took hold of my companion's arm, and called his attention to this somewhat strange circumstance. He only laughed. "Look at the smoke," he cried. "That is rather strange, too." I looked up and saw it pouring over our heads in a long straight cloud, but I did not notice anything odd about it, and I said so. "Can you smell it?" he continued. I sniffed, and noticed for the first time that there had been no smell of smoke at all, though in the earlier part of the journey we had been half blinded with it. I began to feel uncomfortable. There was certainly something unusual about the machine in front of us, and I came to the conclusion that we had had about enough of this kind of sport. "I think we will go back, Lord Beden," I remarked pleasantly, moving one hand towards the lever. "You will go back to perdition, Scott," he answered quietly. "If you meddle with me, we shall be smashed to pieces. We are going 40 miles an hour, and if you distract my attention for a single instant, I won't answer for the consequences." I felt the truth of what he said, and put my hand ostentatiously in my pocket. It was quite evident that I couldn't interfere with him, and equally evident that if we went on as we were going now, we should be dashed to pieces. My only hope was that we should speedily accomplish whatever mad purpose Lord Beden had in his mind, although by now I began to think that he had no other object than suicide. The valley of the Stour was only 2 miles off. But we had been gaining inch by inch down the slope, and were now not more than 30 yards from the machine in front of us. Showers of sparks whirled into our faces, and I kept one arm before my eyes. I soon found, however, that for some reason or other the sparks did not burn my skin, and I was able to resume a more comfortable position and study the occupant of the car. His figure somehow seemed strangely familiar to me, and I tried hard to recollect where I had seen those square shoulders and long, lean limbs before. I wished I could see the man's face, for I was quite certain that I should recognize it. But he never looked back, and appeared to be absolutely unconscious of our presence so close behind him. Nearer we crept, and still nearer, until our front wheels were not more than 10 feet from the platform. The glow of the furnace bathed my companion's face in crimson light, and the figure of the man in front of us stood out like a black demon toiling at the eternal fires. "Be careful, Lord Beden," I cried. "We shall be into it." He turned to me with a smile of triumph, and I thought I saw the light of madness in his eyes. "Do you know what I am going to do?" he said in a low voice, putting his lips close to my ear. "I am going to break it to bits. We have a little speed in hand yet, and when we get to the slope of the Stour Valley, I shall break the cursed thing to bits." "For heaven's sake," I cried, "put the brake on, Lord Beden. Are you mad?" And I gripped him by the arm. He shook my hand off, and I clung to my seat with every muscle of my body strained to the utmost, for, as I spoke, there was a flash of lightning, and I saw the road dipping, and far below the gleam of water among dark trees, and on the height above a large building with many spires and towers. I idly called to mind that it was the Rockshire County Asylum. Our speed quickened horribly, and the car began to sway from side to side. I saw my companion pull the lever an inch nearer to him and grip the steering wheel with both hands. Then, suddenly, the road seemed to fall away beneath us. We sprang off the ground and dropped downward and forward, like a stone flung from a precipice. We were going to smash clean through the machine in front of us. For 5 seconds I held my breath, only awaiting the awful crash of splintering wood and iron, and the shock that would fling us 50 feet from our seats. But we only touched the ground with a sickening thud, an inch behind the other machine. And then a wonderful thing happened. We began to slowly pierce the rail and platform in front of us, until the man seemed to be almost touching our feet. And at last I saw his face, a wild, dark face, with madness in the eyes, and the face of Lord Beden, as I had seen a portrait of him in Beden Hall, taken 30 years ago. My companion rose on his seat and grappled with his own likeness, but he seemed to be only clutching the air, and neither car nor occupant appeared to have any tangible substance. Steadily and silently we bored our way clean through the machine, inch by inch, foot by foot, through the blazing furnace, through the framework of the boiler, through bolt and bar and stanchion, through whirring flywheel and pulsing shaft and piston, until there was nothing beyond us but the dip of the white road. And looking back, I saw the whole dark mass running behind our back wheels. Lord Beden was still standing and tearing at the air with his fingers. Our car was running without guidance, and I sprang to the steering wheel and reversed the lever, but it was too late. We struck something at the side of the road, and the whole machine made a leap from the ground. There was a rush of air, an awful shock and crash, and then darkness. A week afterwards, in the hospital, they told me Lord Beden was dead. He had fallen on a large piece of scrap iron by the roadside, and nearly every bone in his body had been broken. I myself had had a miraculous escape by falling into a thick clump of gorse, and had got off with a broken arm and dislocated collarbone. But I was not able to get about for 2 months. I said nothing of what had happened, and the accident required but little explanation. Motor car accidents are common enough, especially on slopes like that of the Stour Valley. When I was able to get about, however, I visited the scene of the disaster. A friend of mine, one of the doctors at the county lunatic asylum, called for me and drove me over to the place. The smash had occurred nearly halfway down the hillside, close to a ruined shed. The ground was covered with gorse and bracken, but here and there huge pieces of rusty iron were scattered about. Some of them were sharp and brown and ugly, but many were overgrown with creeping convolvulus. They looked as if they had once been parts of some great machine. "A curious coincidence," said my companion, as we drove away from the place. "What do you mean?" "I have been told," he continued, "that 30 years ago this old shed was used by the late Earl's elder brother. He was a mechanical genius, and they say that his efforts to work out some particular invention in practical form drove him off his head. He was allowed to have this place as a workshop, and, under the supervision of 2 keepers, worked on his invention till the day of his death. It was thought that perhaps he would recover his reason if he ever accomplished the task. But in some mysterious way his plans were stolen from him no fewer than 3 times, and after the 3rd time the poor fellow lost heart and destroyed himself. I have heard it whispered by one of my colleagues up yonder that the late Earl was not altogether ignorant of these thefts, but this is probably only gossip. All the fragments of iron you saw lying about were parts of the machine. Heaven knows what it was." I did not venture any suggestion on this point, but I think I could have done so. My adventure in Norfolk. by A.J. Allen. I don't know how it is with you, but during February my wife generally says to me, "Have you thought at all about what we are going to do for August?" And, of course, I say no, and then she begins looking through the advertisements of bungalows to let. Well, this happened last year, as usual, and she eventually produced one that looked possible. It said, Norfolk, Hickling Broad, furnished bungalow, garden, garage, boathouse, and all the rest of it. Oh, and plate and linen. It also mentioned an exorbitant rent. I pointed out the bit about the rent, but my wife said, "Yes, you'll have to go down and see the landlord and get him to come down. They always do." As a matter of fact, they always don't, but that's a detail. Anyway, I wrote off to the landlord and asked if he could arrange for me to stay the night in the place, to see what it was really like. He wrote back and said, certainly, and that he was engaging Mrs. So-and-so to come in and oblige me and make up the beds, and so forth. I tell you, we do things thoroughly in our family. I have to sleep in all the beds, and when I come home, my wife counts the bruises and decides whether they will do or not. At any rate, I arrived, in a blinding snowstorm, at about the most desolate spot on God's earth. I'd come to Potter Heigham by train and been driven on. It was a good 5 miles from the station. Fortunately, Mrs. Selston, the old lady who was going to do for me, was there, and she'd lighted a fire and cooked me a steak, for which I was truly thankful. I somehow think the cow, or whatever they get steaks off, had only died that morning. It was very, obstinate. While I dined, she talked to me. She would tell me all about an operation her husband had just had. All about it. It was almost a lecture on surgery. The steak was rather underdone, and it sort of made me feel I was illustrating her lecture. Anyway, she put me clean off my dinner, and then departed for the night. I explored the bungalow and just had a look outside. It was, of course, very dark, but not snowing quite so hard. The garage stood about 15 yards from the back door. I walked round it, but didn't go in. I also went down to the edge of the Broad and verified the boathouse. The whole place looked as though it might be all right in the summer-time, but just then it made one wonder why people ever wanted to go to the North Pole. Anyhow, I went indoors and settled down by the fire. You've no idea how quiet it was. Even the waterfowl had taken a night off. At least, they weren't working. At a few minutes to 11, I heard the first noise there'd been since Mrs. What's-her-name, Selston, had cleared out. It was the sound of a car. If it had gone straight by, I probably shouldn't have noticed it at all. Only it didn't go straight by. It seemed to stop farther up the road before it got to the house. Even that didn't make much impression. After all, cars do stop. It must have been 5 or 10 minutes before it was borne in on me that it hadn't gone on again. So I got up and looked out of the window. It had left off snowing, and there was a glare through the gate that showed that there were headlamps somewhere just out of sight. I thought I might as well stroll out and investigate. I found a fair-sized limousine pulled up in the middle of the road, about 20 yards short of my gate. The light was rather blinding, but when I got close to it, I found a girl with the bonnet open, tinkering with the engine. Quite an attractive young female, from what one could see, but she was so muffled up in furs that it was rather hard to tell. I said, "Good evening. Anything I can do?" She said she didn't know what was the matter. The engine had just stopped, and wouldn't start again. And it had. It wouldn't even turn, either with the self-starter or the handle. The whole thing was awfully hot, and I asked her whether there was any water in the radiator. She didn't see why there shouldn't be. There always had been. Well, this didn't strike me as entirely conclusive. I said we'd better put some in and see what happened. She said, why not use snow? But I thought not. There was an idea at the back of my mind that there was some reason why it was unwise to use melted snow, and it wasn't until I arrived back with a bucketful that I remembered what it was. Of course, goiter. When I got back to her, she'd got the radiator cap off and inserted what a Danish friend of mine calls a funeral. We poured a little water in. Luckily, I'd warned her to stand clear. The first tablespoon that went in came straight out again, red hot, and blew the funeral sky high. We waited a few minutes until things had cooled down a bit, but it was no go. As fast as we poured water in, it simply ran out again into the road underneath. It was quite evident that she'd been driving with the radiator bone dry, and that her engine had seized right up. I told her so. She said, "Does that mean I've got to stop here all night?" Well, I explained to her that it wasn't as bad as all that. That is, if she cared to accept the hospitality of my poor roof. And it was a poor roof. It let the wet in. But she wouldn't hear of it. By the by, she didn't know the circumstances, so it wasn't that. No, she wanted to leave the car where it was and go on foot. I said, "Don't be silly, it's miles to anywhere." However, at that moment we heard a car coming along the road, the same way as she'd come. We could see its lights too, although it was a very long way off. You know how flat Norfolk is. You can see a terrific distance. I said, "Well, there's the way out of all your troubles. This thing, whatever it is, will give you a tow to the nearest garage, or at any rate a lift to some hotel." One would have expected her to show some relief, but she didn't. I began to wonder what she jolly well did want. She wouldn't let me help her to stop where she was, and she didn't seem anxious for anyone to help her to go anywhere else. She was quite peculiar about it. She gripped hold of my arm and said, "What do you think this is that's coming?" I said, "Well, I'm sure I don't know, being a stranger in these parts, but it sounds like a lorry full of milk cans." I offered to lay her sixpence about it. This was before the betting tax came in. She'd have had to pay, too, because it was a lorry full of milk cans. The driver had to pull up, because there wasn't room to get by. He got down and asked if there was anything he could do to help. We explained the situation. He said he was going to Norwich, and was quite ready to give her a tow if she wanted it. However, she wouldn't do that, and it was finally decided to shove her car into my garage for the night, to be sent for next day, and the lorry was to take her along to Norwich. Well, I managed to find the key of the garage, and the lorry driver, Williams his name was, and I ran the car in and locked the door. This having been done, ablative absolute, I suggested that it was a very cold night. Williams agreed, and said he didn't mind if he did. So I took them both indoors, and mixed them a stiff whisky and water each. There wasn't any soda. And naturally the whole thing had left me very cold too. I hadn't an overcoat on. Up to now I hadn't seriously considered the young woman. For one thing, it had been dark, and there had been a seized engine to look at. I'm afraid that's not a very gallant remark. What I mean is that to anyone with a mechanical mind, a motor car in that condition is much more interesting than... well, it is very interesting, but why labour the point? However, in the sitting-room, in the lamplight, it was possible to get more of an idea. She was a little older than I'd thought, and her eyes were too close together. Of course, she wasn't a... how shall I put it? Her manners weren't quite easy, and she was careful with her English. You know. But that wasn't it. She treated us with a lack of friendliness which was... well, we'd done nothing to deserve it. There was a sort of vague hostility and suspicion, which seemed rather hard lines, considering. Also, she was so anxious to keep in the shadow that if I hadn't moved the lamp away, she'd never have got near the fire at all. And the way she hurried the wretched Williams over his drink was quite distressing, and foolish too, as he was going to drive. But that was her funnel. When he'd gone out to start up his engine, I asked her if she was all right for money, and she apparently was. Then they started off, and I shut up the place and went upstairs. There happened to be a local guidebook in my bedroom with maps in it. I looked at these and couldn't help wondering where the girl in the car had come from. I mean, my road seemed so very unimportant. The sort of road one might use if one wanted to avoid people. If one were driving a stolen car, for instance. This was quite a thrilling idea. I thought it might be worthwhile having another look at the car. So I once more unhooked the key from the kitchen dresser and sallied forth into the snow. It was as black as pitch, and so still that my candle hardly flickered. It wasn't a large garage, and the car nearly filled it. By the by, we'd backed it in so as to make it easier to tow it out again. The engine I'd already seen, so I squeezed past along the wall and opened the door in the body part of the car. At least, I only turned the handle, and the door was pushed open from the inside, and something fell out on me. It pushed me quite hard, and wedged me against the wall. It also knocked the candle out of my hand, and left me in the dark, which was a bit of a nuisance. I wondered what on earth the thing was, barging into me like that, so I felt it, rather gingerly, and found it was a man. A dead man, with a moustache. He'd evidently been sitting propped up against the door. I managed to put him back, as decorously as possible, and shut the door again. After a lot of grovelling about under the car, I found the candle and lighted it, and opened the opposite door, and switched on the little lamp in the roof. And then... Of course, I had to make some sort of examination. He was an extremely tall and thin individual. He must have been well over 6'3". He was dark and very cadaverous-looking. In fact, I don't suppose he'd ever looked so cadaverous in his life. He was wearing a trench coat. It wasn't difficult to tell what he'd died of. He'd been shot through the back. I found the hole just under the right scrofula, or scalpel. What is shoulder blade, anyway? Oh, clavicle. Stupid of me. Well, that's where it was, and the bullet had evidently gone through into the lung. I say evidently, and leave it at that. There were no papers in his pockets, and no tailor's name on his clothes, but there was a note case with £9 in it. Altogether a most unpleasant business. Of course, it doesn't do to question the workings of Providence, but one couldn't help wishing it hadn't happened. It was just a little mysterious, too. Who had killed him? It wasn't likely that the girl had, or she wouldn't have been joy-riding about the country with him. And if someone else had murdered him, why hadn't she mentioned it? Anyway, she hadn't, and she'd gone, so one couldn't do anything for the time being. No telephone, of course. I just locked up the garage and went to bed. That was 2 o'clock. Next morning I woke early, for some reason or other, and it occurred to me as a good idea to go and have a look at things by daylight, and before Mrs. Selston turned up. So I did. The first thing that struck me was that it had snowed heavily during the night, because there were no wheel tracks or footprints, and the second was that I'd left the key in the garage door. I opened it and went in. The place was completely empty. No car, no body, no nothing. There was a patch of grease on the floor where I dropped the candle. Otherwise, there was nothing to show I'd been there before. One of two things must have happened. Either some people had come along during the night and taken the car away, or else I'd fallen asleep in front of the fire and dreamt the whole thing. Then I remembered the whisky glasses. They should still be in the sitting-room. I went back to look, and they were, all 3 of them. So it hadn't been a dream, and the car had been fetched away. But they must have been jolly quiet over it. The girl had left her glass on the mantelpiece, and it showed several very clearly defined finger marks. Some were mine, naturally, because I'd fetched the glass from the kitchen and poured out the drink for her, but hers, her finger marks, were clean, and mine were oily, so it was quite easy to tell them apart. It isn't necessary to point out that this glass was very important. There'd evidently been a murder, or something of that kind, and the girl must have known all about it, even if she hadn't actually done it herself, so anything she had left in the way of evidence ought to be handed over to the police. And this was all she had left. So I packed it up with meticulous care in an old biscuit box out of the larder. When Mrs. Selston came, I settled up with her and came back to town. Oh, I called on the landlord on the way and told him I'd let him know about the bungalow. Then I caught my train and in due course drove straight to Scotland Yard. I went up and saw my friend there. I produced the glass and asked him if his people could identify the marks. He said, probably not, but he sent it down to the fingerprint department and asked me where it came from. I said, never you mind, let's have the identification first. He said, all right. They're awfully quick, these people. The clerk was back in 3 minutes with a file of papers. They knew the girl all right. They told me her name and showed me her photograph. Not flattering. Quite an adventurous lady, from all accounts. In the early part of her career, she'd done time twice for shoplifting, chiefly in the book department. Then she'd what they call taken up with a member of one of those race gangs one sometimes hears about. My pal went on to say that there'd been a fight between 2 of these gangs, in the course of which her friend had got shot. She'd managed to get him away in a car, but it had broken down somewhere in Norfolk, so she'd left it and the dead man in someone's garage, and had started off for Norwich in a lorry. Only she never got there. On the way, the lorry had skidded, and both she and the driver, a fellow called Williams, had been thrown out, and they'd rammed their heads against a brick wall, which everyone knows is a fatal thing to do. At least it was in their case. I said, look here, it's all very well, but you simply can't know all this. There hasn't been time. It only happened last night. He said, last night be blowed. It all happened in February 1919. The people you've described have been dead for years. I said, oh. And to think that I might have stuck to that £9. The Bus Conductor by E. F. Benson. My friend, Hugh Granger, and I had just returned from a 2 days' visit in the country, where we had been staying in a house of sinister repute, which was supposed to be haunted by ghosts of a peculiarly fearsome and truculent sort. The house itself was all that such a house should be, Jacobean and oak-panelled, with long dark passages and high-vaulted rooms. It stood also very remote, and was encompassed by a wood of sombre pines, that muttered and whispered in the dark. And all the time that we were there, a southwesterly gale with torrents of scalding rain had prevailed, so that by day and night weird voices moaned and fluted in the chimneys. A company of uneasy spirits held colloquy among the trees, and sudden tattoos and tappings beckoned from the window-panes. But in spite of these surroundings, which were sufficient in themselves, one would almost say, to spontaneously generate occult phenomena, nothing of any description had occurred. I am bound to add, also, that my own state of mind was peculiarly well adapted to receive, or even to invent, the sights and sounds we had gone to seek. For I was, I confess, during the whole time that we were there, in a state of abject apprehension, and lay awake both nights through hours of terrified unrest, afraid of the dark, yet more afraid of what a lighted candle might show me. Hugh Granger, on the evening after our return to town, had dined with me, and after dinner our conversation, as was natural, soon came back to these entrancing topics. "But why you go ghost-seeking, I cannot imagine," he said. "Because your teeth were chattering, and your eyes starting out of your head all the time you were there, from sheer fright. Or do you like being frightened? Hugh, though generally intelligent, is dense in certain ways. This is one of them. "Why, of course I like being frightened," I said. "I want to be made to creep and creep and creep. Fear is the most absorbing and luxurious of emotions. One forgets all else if one is afraid." "Well, the fact that neither of us saw anything," he said, "confirms what I have always believed." "And what have you always believed?" "That these phenomena are purely objective, not subjective, and that one's state of mind has nothing to do with the perception that perceives them, nor have circumstances or surroundings anything to do with them either. Look at Osburton. It has had the reputation of being a haunted house for years, and it certainly has all the accessories of one. Look at yourself, too, with all your nerves on edge, afraid to look round or light a candle for fear of seeing something. Surely there was the right man in the right place then, if ghosts are subjective." He got up and lit a cigarette, and looking at him, Hugh is about 6 feet high and as broad as he is long, I felt a retort on my lips, for I could not help my mind going back to a certain period in his life when, from some cause which, as far as I knew, he had never told anybody, he had become a mere quivering mass of disordered nerves. Oddly enough, at the same moment, and for the first time, he began to speak of it himself. "You may reply that it was not worth my while to go either," he said, "because I was so clearly the wrong man in the wrong place. But I wasn't. You, for all your apprehensions and expectancy, have never seen a ghost, but I have, though I am the last person in the world you would have thought likely to do so, and though my nerves are steady enough again now, it knocked me all to bits." He sat down again in his chair. "No doubt you remember my going to bits," he said, "and since I believe that I am sound again now, I should rather like to tell you about it. But before I couldn't. I couldn't speak of it at all to anybody. Yet there ought to have been nothing frightening about it. What I saw was certainly a most useful and friendly ghost, but it came from the shaded side of things. It looked suddenly out of the night and the mystery with which life is surrounded. I want first to tell you quite shortly my theory about ghost-seeing," he continued, "and I can explain it best by a simile, an image. Imagine, then, that you and I, and everybody in the world, are like people whose eye is directly opposite a little tiny hole in a sheet of cardboard, which is continually shifting and revolving and moving about. Back to back with that sheet of cardboard is another, which also, by laws of its own, is in perpetual but independent motion. In it, too, there is another hole, and when, fortuitously it would seem, these two holes, the one through which we are always looking, and the other in the spiritual plane, come opposite one another, we see through, and then only do the sights and sounds of the spiritual world become visible or audible to us. With most people, these holes never come opposite each other during their life, but at the hour of death they do, and then they remain stationary. That, I fancy, is how we pass over. Now, in some natures, these holes are comparatively large, and are constantly coming into opposition. Clairvoyants, mediums, are like that. But, as far as I knew, I had no clairvoyant or mediumistic powers at all. I, therefore, am the sort of person who long ago made up his mind that he never would see a ghost. It was, so to speak, an incalculable chance that my minute spy-hole should come into opposition with the other. But it did, and it knocked me out of time. I had heard some such theory before, and though Hugh put it rather picturesquely, there was nothing in the least convincing or practical about it. It might be so, or again, it might not. "I hope your ghost was more original than your theory," said I, in order to bring him to the point. "Yes, I think it was. You shall judge." I put on more coal and poked up the fire. Hugh has got, so I have always considered, a great talent for telling stories, and that sense of drama which is so necessary for the narrator. Indeed, before now, I have suggested to him that he should take this up as a profession, sit by the fountain in Piccadilly Circus, when times are, as usual, bad, and tell stories to the passers-by in the street, Arabian fashion, for reward. The most part of mankind, I am aware, do not like long stories, but to the few, among whom I number myself, who really like to listen to lengthy accounts of experiences, Hugh is an ideal narrator. I do not care for his theories, or for his similes, but when it comes to facts, to things that happened, I like him to be lengthy. "Go on, please, and slowly," I said. "Brevity may be the soul of wit, but it is the ruin of storytelling. I want to hear when and where and how it all was, and what you had for lunch, and where you had dined, and what—" Hugh began. "It was the 24th of June, just 18 months ago," he said. "I had let my flat, you may remember, and came up from the country to stay with you for a week. We had dined alone here." I could not help interrupting. "Did you see the ghost here?" I asked. "In this square little box of a house in a modern street?" "I was in the house when I saw it." I hugged myself in silence. "We had dined alone here in Graham Street," he said, "and after dinner I went out to some party, and you stopped at home. At dinner your man did not wait, and when I asked where he was, you told me he was ill, and, I thought, changed the subject rather abruptly. You gave me your latchkey when I went out, and on coming back I found you had gone to bed. There were, however, several letters for me which required answers. I wrote them there and then, and posted them at the pillar box opposite. So I suppose it was rather late when I went upstairs. You had put me in the front room, on the 3rd floor, overlooking the street, a room which I thought you generally occupied yourself. It was a very hot night, and though there had been a moon when I started to my party, on my return the whole sky was cloud-covered, and it both looked and felt as if we might have a thunderstorm before morning. I was feeling very sleepy and heavy, and it was not till after I had got into bed that I noticed by the shadows of the window frames on the blind that only one of the windows was open. But it did not seem worthwhile to get out of bed in order to open it, though I felt rather airless and uncomfortable, and I went to sleep. What time it was when I awoke I do not know, but it was certainly not yet dawn, and I never remember being conscious of such an extraordinary stillness as prevailed. There was no sound either of foot passengers or wheeled traffic. The music of life appeared to be absolutely mute. But now, instead of being sleepy and heavy, I felt, though I must have slept an hour or two at most, since it was not yet dawn, perfectly fresh and wide awake, and the effort which had seemed not worth making before, that of getting out of bed and opening the other window, was quite easy now, and I pulled up the blind, threw it wide open, and leaned out, for somehow I parched and pined for air. Even outside, the oppression was very noticeable, and though, as you know, I am not easily given to feel the mental effects of climate, I was aware of an awful creepiness coming over me, I tried to analyse it away, but without success. The past day had been pleasant. I looked forward to another pleasant day tomorrow, and yet I was full of some nameless apprehension. I felt, too, dreadfully lonely in this stillness before the dawn. Then I heard suddenly, and not very far away, the sound of some approaching vehicle. I could distinguish the tread of 2 horses, walking at a slow foot's pace. They were, though not yet visible, coming up the street, and yet this indication of life did not abate that dreadful sense of loneliness which I have spoken of. Also, in some dim, unformulated way, that which was coming seemed to me to have something to do with the cause of my oppression. Then the vehicle came into sight. At first I could not distinguish what it was. Then I saw that the horses were black and had long tails, and that what they dragged was made of glass, but had a black frame. It was a hearse. Empty. It was moving up this side of the street. It stopped at your door. Then the obvious solution struck me. You had said at dinner that your man was ill, and you were, I thought, unwilling to speak more about his illness. No doubt, so I imagined now, he was dead, and for some reason, perhaps because you did not want me to know anything about it, you were having the body removed at night. This, I must tell you, passed through my mind quite instantaneously, and it did not occur to me how unlikely it really was, before the next thing happened. I was still leaning out of the window, and I remember also wondering, yet only momentarily, how odd it was that I saw things, or rather the one thing I was looking at, so very distinctly. Of course, there was a moon behind the clouds, but it was curious how every detail of the hearse and the horses was visible. There was only one man, the driver, with it, and the street was otherwise absolutely empty. It was at him I was looking now. I could see every detail of his clothes, but from where I was, so high above him, I could not see his face. He had on grey trousers, brown boots, a black coat buttoned all the way up, and a straw hat. Over his shoulder there was a strap, which seemed to support some sort of little bag. He looked exactly like— well, from my description, what did he look exactly like? Why, a bus conductor, I said instantly. So I thought. And even while I was thinking this, he looked up at me. He had a rather long, thin face, and on his left cheek there was a mole with a growth of dark hair on it. All this was as distinct as if it had been noonday, and as if I was within a yard of him. But so instantaneous was all that takes so long in the telling, I had not time to think it strange that the driver of a hearse should be so unfunereally dressed. Then he touched his hat to me, and jerked his thumb over his shoulder. "Just room for one inside, sir," he said. There was something so odious, so coarse, so unfeeling about this, that I instantly drew my head in, pulled the blind down again, and then, for what reason I do not know, turned on the electric light in order to see what time it was. The hands of my watch pointed to 11:30. It was then, for the first time, I think, that a doubt crossed my mind as to the nature of what I had just seen. But I put out the light again, got into bed, and began to think. We had dined, I had gone to a party, I had come back and written letters, had gone to bed, and had slept. So how could it be 11:30? Or What 11:30 was it? Then another easy solution struck me. My watch must have stopped. But it had not. I could hear it ticking. There was stillness and silence again. I expected every moment to hear muffled footsteps on the stairs, footsteps moving slowly and smallly under the weight of a heavy burden. But from inside the house there was no sound whatever. Outside, too, there was the same dead silence, while the hearse waited at the door. And the minutes ticked on and ticked on, and at length I began to see a difference in the light in the room, and knew that the dawn was beginning to break outside. But how had it happened, then, that if the corpse was to be removed at night, it had not gone, and that the hearse still waited, when morning was already coming? Presently I got out of bed again, and, with the sense of strong physical shrinking, I went to the window and pulled back the blind. The dawn was coming fast. The whole street was lit by that silver, hueless light of morning. But there was no hearse there. Once again I looked at my watch. It was just 4:15. But I would swear that not half an hour had passed since it had told me that it was 11:30. Then a curious double sense, as if I was living in the present and at the same moment had been living in some other time, came over me. It was dawn on June 25th, and the street, as natural, was empty. But a little while ago the driver of a hearse had spoken to me, and it was 11:30. What was that driver? To what plane did he belong? And again, what 11:30 was it that I had seen recorded on the dial of my watch? And then I told myself that the whole thing had been a dream. But if you ask me whether I believed what I told myself, I must confess that I did not. Your man did not appear at breakfast next morning, nor did I see him again before I left that afternoon. I think if I had, I should have told you all about this, but it was still possible, you see, that what I had seen was a real hearse, driven by a real driver, for all the ghostly gaiety of the face that had looked up into mine, and the levity of his pointing hand. I might possibly have fallen asleep soon after seeing him, and slumbered through the removal of the body and the departure of the hearse, so I did not speak of it to you. There was something wonderfully straightforward and prosaic in all this. Here were no Jacobean houses, oak-panelled and surrounded by weeping pine trees, and somehow the very absence of suitable surroundings made the story more impressive. But for a moment a doubt assailed me. "Don't tell me it was all a dream," I said. "I don't know whether it was or not. I can only say that I believe myself to have been wide awake. In any case, the rest of the story is odd." "I went out of town again that afternoon," he continued, "and I may say that I don't think that even for a moment did I get the haunting sense of what I had seen, or dreamed, that night, out of my mind. It was present to me, always, as some vision unfulfilled. It was as if some clock had struck the 4 quarters, and I was still waiting to hear what the hour would be. Exactly a month afterwards, I was in London again, but only for the day. I arrived at Victoria about 11, and took the Underground to Sloane Square, in order to see if you were in town, and would give me lunch. It was a baking-hot morning, and I intended to take a bus from the King's Road as far as Graham Street. There was one standing at the corner, just as I came out of the station, but I saw that the top was full, and the inside appeared to be full also. Just as I came up to it, the conductor, who, I suppose, had been inside, collecting fares or what-not, came out onto the step within a few feet of me. He wore grey trousers, brown boots, a black coat buttoned, a straw hat, and over his shoulder was a strap, on which hung his little machine for punching tickets. I saw his face, too. It was the face of the driver of the hearse, with a mole on the left cheek. Then he spoke to me, jerking his thumb over his shoulder. "Just room for one inside, sir," he said. At that, a sort of panic terror took possession of me, and I knew I gesticulated wildly with my arms and cried, "No, no!" But at that moment I was living not in the hour which was then passing, but in that hour which had passed a month ago, when I leaned from the window of your bedroom here, just before the dawn broke. At this moment, too, I knew that my spy-hole had been opposite the spy-hole into the spiritual world. What I had seen there had some significance, now being fulfilled, beyond the significance of the trivial happenings of today and tomorrow. The powers, of which we know so little, were visibly working before me. And I stood there on the pavement, shaking and trembling. I was opposite the post office at the corner, and just as the bus started, my eye fell on the clock in the window there. I need not tell you what the time was. Perhaps I need not tell you the rest, for you probably conjecture it, since you will not have forgotten what happened at the corner of Sloane Square at the end of July, the summer before last. The bus pulled out from the pavement into the street, in order to get round a van that was standing in front of it. At the moment there came down the King's Road a big motor going at a hideously dangerous pace. It crashed full into the bus, burrowing into it, as a gimlet burrows into a board. He paused. "And that's my story," he said. You've been listening to a bite-sized audiobook, read by me, Simon Stanhope. If you enjoy this content, please subscribe, click like, leave a comment if you'd like to, and do check out my playlists and podcast series of more than 200 past recordings if you'd like to hear more. If you'd like to help me to keep producing new content, you can find links on screen now or in the video description to my Patreon page, or to buy me a coffee, or join as a channel member here on YouTube. Another great way to support me is via Bandcamp, bitesizedaudio.bandcamp.com, where you can subscribe for extra content, as well as purchase and download high-quality audio files to keep. This recording is copyright Bitesized Audio 2026. Thank you for listening.